Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carolin Emcke. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung and Schaubühne to our event today, Streitraum Libertarian, Authoritarian, Fascist, the specific constellations in Latin America. With Javier Milei in Argentina, José Antonio Kast in Chile, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Variations of the libertarian authoritarian movement have taken hold in Latin America. What kind of ideologic objectives and programs are discernible? How do they actually restructure the democratic setup? And to what extent do revisionists reviews of the past lead to relativization of the crime? And what role do racist projections and resentments take place? And what kind of disruptive forces are enacted upon the welfare state? What political alliances do the Latin American right-wing forces tie to other authoritarian movements? And what role is the role of Donald Trump and his imperial foreign policy? I'd like to talk about all of these points with our guests. And just as a technicality, we have from Santiago de Chile, we are joined at a really inhumanly early time. Mauro Basaure, who was born in Chile, is a professor and a director of the PhD program Critical Theory and Contemporary Society. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for getting up so early. On my right-hand side, Clayton Nascimento, born 1988 in Sao Paulo. He's an actor, director, and author. He is currently on a visit here at the festival here at the Schaubühne. And yesterday, I think you had your first two premieres, and this afternoon and tomorrow we will also have a presentation. So welcome, Clayton. And to my left-hand side, Claudia, Zilla, born 1973 in Buenos Aires. He has a PhD in political sciences and is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Foreign and Security Policies, the German Institute for International and Security Policies in Berlin. And since 2005, she's been a member of the research group Americas in said foundation. Welcome, Claudia Zilla. So, the person you cannot see but hear are our interpreters, Astrid Gese and Alexander Schmidt. And thank you very much for the simultaneous interpreting service. At the outset, I'd like to make a personal remark. This is really one of the events that I've been looking forward to. Obviously, I'm always looking forward to all events, but this is a very specific and salient event. I have a particular passion for Latin America and a connection to Latin America, and I'm very, very pleased to be hosting this meeting. I also have to say that probably we will fail in our ambition to have all of the perspectives from this host of different countries and to really do justice to the reality in all of these countries, and at the same time to attempt to discern systematic connections and also perhaps personal connections, historical connections, looking for similarities in structures and patterns. If you're really interested in individual countries, you might be disappointed, but if you're also interested, and those who are just focusing on systematic aspects might also be disappointed. But, and I hasten to add that, maybe those who are here, after 1.5 hours, you will also have the possibility to field your questions once we've wrapped up our conversation on the stage. So I'd like to structure our conversation, our debate, with certain concepts that we are being asked to look at during our season here. We're looking at libertarian, authoritarian, and fascist aspects and the various assaults on democracy that are linked to these ideological movements and also linked to certain regimes. First and foremost, I'd like to look at what we perhaps conceive as being authoritarian or fascist, with a specific view to Chile. Because of the three countries present here, I think that is the country where just recently at the presidential elections, a candidate came out on top who hails from the right-wing spectrum. So this is the most recent development, and therefore I'd like to ask Mauro in Santiago de Chile, what kind of ideological motives or maybe figures of thought actually define the authoritarian tendency in Chile under the new presidency of Antonio Kast? Yes, hello, and greetings from Chile. And greetings to Claudia, Carolin, and Clayton, and obviously also the public at the Schaubühne. It is a great pleasure for me to be present in a virtual way. But coming back to the question, I think I would start with a certain caveat in terms of definition. I think this is also inherent in your question. I think we need to avoid two mistakes. First of all of these right-wing movements in Latin America are not identical. I think that would be wrong to put them all in the same basket, and also to say that they are not linked to each other. This right-wing movement has a joint constellation, but Kast, Milei, Bolsonaro, Orban, Meloni or Trump, I mean, you can add to those names. They are not all on the same page necessarily in this constellation or at the same position. Kast is not a genuinely Chilean anomaly, but he's also not just a carbon copy of those other leaders that I just mentioned. He is a radicalization, or he represents radicalization of the Chilean right-wing movement, and I think that is important to stress that this is a story that goes way back in Chile, from starting with Pinochet and right up to the present day. He comes from the Unión Demócrata Independiente, the UDI, which is a central party in the political right-wing spectrum in Chile that was founded during the dictatorship. And this is very, very important. A couple of years ago, he as I said, he actually denigrated and mocked the sort of the hapless right-wing movement. So he comes from this tradition of criticizing also a soft version of the right wing. So he's, in a way, he's also an outsider, and different to Milei. And I'm not an expert on Argentina, but he is not from outside of the system. He comes actually from inside of the Chilean right-wing movement and spectrum, and he's trying to push that spectrum further to the right. Can you say what topics, what ideological program, what are the most salient political points that Kast posits? Firstly, I would say there's an authoritarian dimension, order, sanctioning, police, controlling the border, control. And then there's also another dimension about the Chilean identity, and there's a certain idea also that is set up also vis-a-vis foreigners. So there's an automatic kind of racism? No. Actually, there is never a mention of Venezuelans. There's no particular group that is being designated. It's just immigrants in a generic sense. And it's always linked to crime and that discourse. And thirdly, there is also a political dimension that posits sort of an organically healthy community, the true Chileans, and sets that off against the progressive elite. And what you can also see is a neoliberal dimension, reducing the social welfare state, increasing the market, protection of investments, and fiscal discipline. So these are not identical dimensions. You need to differentiate. You can say nativistic, nationalistic, and at the same time you can also be neoliberal. Same as with some European right-wing groups. So it's really about the defense of the national citizen. Now, coming back to him as a person, how does that have an impact on his policies? He hails from a very Catholic background, and probably most of those present here know this, but maybe we need to stress that again. He hails from a German immigrant family. Maybe you can say a bit more about the person, Kast himself, and his persona and his Catholic imprint. Kast is a practicing Catholic. The Schönstatt movement, is that known in Germany? No. It's a very, very conservative Catholic movement in Chile. And it also has a very, very strong link to moral conservatism. But this moral conservatism is also linked to economic liberalism, hard-edge security policies, and all of that is linked to the Catholicism in some way. He does not differentiate or separate these aspects. He's a practicing Catholic, and at the same time, that also informs his policies. And we will probably get back to that later on, but it is within a certain context of his program as well. Kast and his people in the government refer to the government of emergency, meaning that the entire debate about morals, ethical aspects, and values is set in this context. They know that that is problematic, and everything is switched to this kind of emergency state or contingency. So, a state of emergency, I think it's very, very important because there's a certain dimension, a political dimension, in this way of governing under emergency conditions. Maybe also moving those who know Chile very well. Maybe we can come back to what you say. What do you see in what Mauro just identified? And maybe you could also systematically analyze it. What do you recognize in terms of patterns there?
I'm happy to answer your question. And, I mean, you talked about movements and regimes and authoritarian politics. Now, we have to differentiate, I'd say, because you can go and say there is an authoritarian world vision, an idea of the world, a general authoritarian thinking when talking about particular persons. But then you can also talk about authoritarian politics or policy. And this means there is a particular way of implementing politics. So you might have democratic contents, but you might go and implement them in an authoritarian way. Like, for example, if you don't have the rule of law applied. So we have to differentiate, and we also have to distinguish between content and form. And Now, there is a third layer, because if you have a successful implementation of these ideas, and if the implementation is an authoritarian one, the political system changes as a whole, and then you speak of authoritarian systems. Otherwise, you wouldn't call it an authoritarian regime. What we see in the countries you mentioned is a partly authoritarian regime, and it's problematic because I do see the authoritarian impact in the world vision. So I'd say Kast, that's not authoritarian politics because he hasn't ruled that long, but he has authoritarian ideas, and he might want to go and implement these ideas. And what we see today is not an authoritarian regime yet, but we do see authoritarian ideas and visions because he likes the idea of control, of sanctioning. That's quite high on his agenda. And he is not really in favor of a policy of inclusion. And he pretends that he fights crime at its roots. But this is very much about sanctioning, and it's a very conservative agenda in terms of his moral stance, which even goes beyond traditional conservative values. Let me give you an example. There were 3 cases in which abortion in Chile is legal if there is a life danger to the mother, in the case of rape, or if the fetus can't live. So these are the 3 exceptions which are made. The traditional right wing says, okay, we can accept these exceptions, and thus an abortion would be legal. But he goes beyond this conservative approach. So I'd say there is a right-wing radical approach. I think I can say so because he talks about the soft right wing in Chile, and he wants to be different. Mauro said there is the cowardice in the right. There are cowards, the right-wing cowards, he called them. Los cobardes, he said. So they are cowards. That's what Kast says. So I think I can call him a right-wing radical, but it's difficult to find out what is authoritarian in this approach already. I don't want to insinuate that there is no authoritarian approach, but to what point, to what extent, remains to be seen. Well, I would like to ask 2 more questions about Chile, and then I would like to talk about Brazil. So, there is one way of putting it, which is connected to a focus on the ideology. So we might go and say it's right-wing radical. But I would insist on the idea of authoritarianism nevertheless. And thus I would like to ask Mauro, this retrospection we do see with Kast. He looks back at the Pinochet period time, the time of the military, the time which was clearly authoritarian, even fascistoid in some of the details. So I would like to look back to this obsession, fascination, I don't know quite what word to use here, but there is a quite revisionist approach to be seen in Kast with respect to Pinochet's violence, because he does not only consider it less dangerous or harmless, he even celebrates it. He celebrates the time. And this is more than right radical. Yes, I agree. I think there is an authoritarian content in the ideology. Mauro, maybe you can tell us a bit more about the revisionism and this newfound love or cherishing of the dictatorship and the consequences it had in Chile. Oh, it has, actually. Well, I'd say the main strengths of authoritarianism are what Claudia has just described. Now, I'm speaking about the program I've seen. I mean, Kast has been at the helm for 2 months only. But he is, nevertheless, an expression or a manifestation of a movement towards the right, which has been going on for quite a while in Chile. So in our historical memory, we'd find a certain Pinochetization of the common sense, if I may put it this way. I mean, I don't want to insinuate that Chile as a whole has become Pinochetistic, but there is a certain love for authorities, anti-communism, mistrust, and an unwillingness to accept new things. So this is a thing I see, and this has become very evident when the anniversary of the coup d'etat of 1973 was celebrated in Chile. There was a particular way of approaching the history of the dictatorship and the military rule. And this went along with a particular perspective on the Allende government of the time. I mean, it was hard to believe, but people said this government, Allende's government, was to be blamed for the coup d'etat, right? So Kast is kind of riding that wave, I'd say. He's a manifestation in a long-term process. And this is not only about denial. It's not only that people go and say there were crimes. There were no crimes, although there were. But this is also about the responsibility and who is to be blamed and who is called the responsible side. I mean, this argument, like going and saying the government, Allende's government was to be blamed. I mean, it's not so open, but there's a lot of common sense involved. May I add briefly, because it's interesting to look at this shift in the society in Chile. If you look at the surveys made these days, and if you look at the different assessments of different players and institutions, you see that the best rates get the criminal police officers in uniform, and the military forces. Whereas the judicial system gets much worse rankings, and this reflects a bit the attitude in society at large. Yeah, well, let's maybe focus on this particular aspect also in order to talk about Brazil. Brazil is maybe a kind of an extraordinary example because Lula is the president right now, so it's not a right-wing government there. But we do have the experience of the Bolsonaro government, and we talked a bit about different topics and motivations, motifs you see. And we talked about Chile, and I would like to pick one, i.e. the reinforcement of fighting crime, combating crime. The nation is in danger is the attitude which is being brought forward. There is a lot of passion, I'd even say, for hardness, for strictness and sanctions, which is being shown openly and which concerns particular groups in particular. So this goes hand in hand with racism. So, Clayton, maybe you can describe a bit what this particular element meant in the Bolsonaro time, i.e. the focus on combating crime. How did you experience this?
Yes, we have had 4 years of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and it was such a very difficult times for us because when Bolsonaro got in the power in the government, the first thing he did was like to polarize, to separate the country. So half of the country is liked what Bolsonaro did, and the other half absolutely not. So the country into itself started fighting with each other, and we haven't lost this characteristic till nowadays. This year is election year in Brazil, and we are already frightened what can happen with our country because we keep on being polarized. Half of the country likes Bolsonaro and would like to have him back again, and the other side and the other half would not like to have him again. But he is in jail nowadays because they proved that Bolsonaro tried to do a coup in our country, and he's in jail nowadays, and he's forbidden to come back. So he left their son, his son, to be on the election. So this year we are a little bit frightened because we can have Bolsonaro's son in the power. Yes, and we are already paying attention to what is going to happen on October of this year. And Bolsonaro, he had all the elements of authoritarianism. So he started speaking that our election system is not serious, and in Brazil we vote in a machine. And this machine, like you go there and you put the number of the candidate and then you voted. This machine is absolutely serious. Many other countries study our machine, our vote machine, because it's serious. We don't have cups with our election system.
Don't tell anybody in Berlin about election systems, because we had a failed election. We had to repeat it. So this is why the audience is sort of going, into their seats. Everybody's embarrassed.
Yes,
sorry.
But our election system is absolutely serious, and most. No, but I'm not kidding. I swear. I'm not kidding. I'm being serious. And Bolsonaro spread that no, it's not serious. So the election that he lost, he started saying this: if I lose, it's because it's not serious. But if I win, it's serious. And then everybody trusted that. And when he lost, people said, no, it's not serious. So Bolsonaro started defending ideas, anti-democratics. He was going to the street saying that our democratic systems, our democratic politics, our democratic buildings were not serious, and the society believed that. So at the same time, he was always on television saying that our press is not serious, and the press spoke only what they wanted, and that the press did not like Bolsonaro, and that the press did. So every time the press was trying to say something real, something true, society did not believe, because president was saying that our press was not serious. And we have had such a terrific pandemic times in Brazil. So, at around a million people died. And Bolsonaro started saying that, no, we cannot count how many people are dying. We cannot count. So till nowadays, we don't have idea how many people exactly died in Brazil. And when the world started having the injection, the vaccine, Bolsonaro said that it was not important. And look how crazy. He said, if we have had the vaccine, we were going to turn ourselves in alligator. And society believed that.
Kann ich eine Frage stellen zu dem, Entschuldigung, kann ich eine Frage stellen zu der,
Can I ask a question,
zu der Bolsonaro-Zeit und
please,
der
concerning the
Pandemie?
Bolsonaro
Das
time
eine
and the
ist,
pandemic?
Gerade fand ich sehr eindrücklich zu beschreiben, wie Bolsonaro
Interesting to hear what Bolsonaro did in order to undermine the democratic system, against the voting system, against the press, against the vaccines, how he managed to manipulate the people. And I would like to know, with respect to the pandemic, but also to the time before, what about racism? I mean, if you look at the pandemic, you could see who the ones were who died. I mean, it was evident there was racism, wasn't there?
Yes. The most people who died in Brazil was poor, black, and women. White people, they died because 1 million, but percentually speaking, most black people died on pandemic times. And it has been discovered that he was saying to the society, no, you can't have the vaccine. But we discovered that he made something hidden, that his people was having the vaccine. And at the same time, he was saying, no, you cannot have. And then forced him to show his vaccine card. And then he said, no, I didn't have the vaccine. I'm not going to show my card. So he had the vaccine, and he was saying people not to have. So who died on the pandemic times? Black people. And Bolsonaro, when he was doing his campaign to get the election, he was saying that he did not believe the black people because black people was not trustful. So when he got in the power, black people died a lot, because militarism in Bolsonaro was absolutely strong, because he gave positions in the very high level of Brazilian politics to military ones. So they started killing a lot. They started, they killed, and they were hired to a next wonderful place in the government. So racism in the Bolsonaro times was absolutely, because people says that in Brazil, each country has one kind of racism. Yes, in the United States, for example, I have been studying this, huh? In United States, for example, people arrive in front of the other, and then they sell something, they say something very bad about, oh, you are the N-word. In Brazil, they don't say exactly this because it's masquerade, but black people don't have great opportunities of job, occupations. When black people arrive on an occupation, they say, okay, you are a good person to have this position, but could you please cut your hair? Women is not paid the same as men are paid, and if black women is on a position, the same position, if there is a white man in the same position, this white man is going to get to be better paid. So in Bolsonaro times, they left it not masquerade as racism is in Brazil. He left it absolutely openly. And in this time, black people died on the military hand. Black people died because we did not have the access of the vaccine. Black people started, did not have the opportunity to have good positions because it was not what he defended. So now Lula is in the power, and Lula is a very populist president. And the first thing he said is, no, I'm going to help everyone. Bolsonaro took out the opportunities. So now he created new kinds of job. He gave these people new possibilities of living. Brazil has one of the best methods of general vaccine, because our country is very big. And he said, no, we are going to bring back again our vaccine system that is absolutely trustful, and we are going to help these poor people. Now things are changing, but in the end of the year, it may change again.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I want to take up a few of the themes we were talking about. The first is what we also heard in Chile, to look at Brazil, this motif of it's an emergency, the strong law and order program, and how it played out in Brazil under Bolsonaro, and maybe then as a second theme, the question of racism. Entschuldigung, ich spreche auf Englisch, Verzeihung, ich hätte Deutsch sprechen sollen.
Sorry, I was speaking English, should have spoken German there. It's okay, I understood everything. I think I'd go further in the case of Brazil. Conservative, right-wing, radical right-wing scholar. I think Bolsonarism really is almost right there with right-wing extremism. That's what I would first posit. And then we do have a clear threat to the structures of the rule of law and democracy through the coup attempt on the 8th of January. After Lula took office, it was mobilized and driven by Bolsonaro and his followers, and because Bolsonaro is surrounded by a group of people who clearly defend the idea of white supremacy. The supremacy, they're defending the supremacy of the white race, and there is sufficient evidence pointing to that. So I would believe that would say that the racism is more explicit, and the disdain for democratic state institutions is also clearly there, so we can really say that this is right-wing extremism. Well, and the other question was, yes, this was also in the campaign, Kast campaign, something of a strong motif, the mobilization against crime, and how did that actually pan out under Bolsonaro? Yes, and this brings me to another aspect. And in all three cases, I would say, we're faced with populists. And there are situations in Brazil who are a fertile ground for populism and right-wing ideology. Corruption is one of those aspects. It's endemic, it is part of the state structure, and politics in Brazil would not work nowadays without corruption. The way it is set up, the way majorities are gained in parliament, I think it's a structural corruption. Well, you as an Argentinian, if I may interject, just to briefly, so if we say, look at the national sports, Brazil, Argentina, so in terms of corruption, you'd say that it's even more endemic than in Argentina. I'm just asking because yeah, my friend is from Argentina, and I can be quite forthright about it. Well, as a political scientist, I'm looking at that as a political scientist and not as an Argentinian, because otherwise I wouldn't have had to study as hard as I did. It is in the nature of the phenomenon that it is very difficult to measure. How do you measure corruption? I'd say that the way in which the presidential system works in Brazil, where you have a higher fragmentation of the Congress, so that you need an incentive in politics in order to create majorities, the way in which elections are organized and set up, that fosters and promotes a role of corruption within politics, and to a greater degree than in Argentina. But of course, you need to measure that. Brazil, in terms of references, Brazil is much bigger than Argentina in that sense. But you can identify that kind of problem in Brazil that do not exist to the same extent or level in Argentina, but that are conducive to the fact that corruption, for example, such as certain payments take place in politics. And then, of course, there is corruption in Argentina as well. And Chile was considered for a very long time as being free of corruption, just like Uruguay. But even under the previous government, it was clear that corruption does exist, maybe on a different level, but even under Pinochet, it was always said, yes, it was authoritarian, but not corrupt. But those secret accounts were also then discovered that Pinochet had set up abroad. So we always have to assume that there's no country fully free of corruption on this planet. And then the question is, how endemic is it, and then what is its function in its within the political system? And that is really the question in Brazil, but in all three countries, but in particular in Brazil, it is very well known. And the Brazilian companies in Latin America also tried to bribe other governments in order to foster this in other countries. So this is a practice that was also exported, and all of that is being substantiated by various processes that have taken place, and also legal processes. Well, and then I think you need to see corruption and populism, because the populists say, well, corruption is at the level of the elites. Those are resources that should actually belong to the citizens, and those elites are enriching themselves. And I come from the outside of the system, or come from a different party, and I will change this. And I will sort of clean up the state. And this insecurity, and this is something that you touched upon, this insecurity has also very important, well, it's also very important to see the role of organized crime. There are areas, neighborhoods, favelas that are under the control of drug gangs, and in Latin America this is a problem. There's no clear distinction, delineation between the state and non-state actors, and it's one of the most criminal aspects. And this insecurity that people sense, and sometimes perception actually deviates from the actual facts, but the truth is the perception and the feeling that people have, and that is something that fosters and is fertile to give rise to right-wing ideology, strong hand policy, so sanctioning more, also lowering the age to be fully responsible under penal law, and there's also truth in that organized crime is better armed than police forces. So, and then this kind of corruption, first of all, is a good fertile ground for right-wing populism, and then there's also this fertile ground for law and order, or the call for law and order, and all of that subsumes into or collates into this, or conflates into this right-wing extremism. And Mauro, looking at this question, we just heard about Brazil in the first years of Bolsonaro. But in Chile, did it work that way? And I'm sort of putting it in a bit extreme concept here, that this ability of Bolsonaro that worked on the level of populism, that in Chile was kind of reenacted in a way, although in Chile the crime rates were not as high as in Brazil. But the impression was that Kast actually copy-pasted something with the law and order ideology, or is this a completely different rhetoric and a completely different argument?
I believe that
what Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of Bolsonaro, who was invited actually by Kast to the inauguration ceremony. So he was invited. So it's not just a matter of protocol or minor detail, but it shows that Kast, even if he's not Bolsonaro or Milei, is included in a transnational right-wing constellation, and he belongs to it without being identical to the aforementioned. I think that's important. But the differences are central as well. Bolsonaro, in my opinion, illustrates the link between right-wing extremism, militarism, the police force, and even evangelical tendencies, I think that's the correct term for it, and authoritarian nostalgia. I think that's even much stronger, much more direct and discernible than in Chile. And during, I mean, the exaltation of war militarism, manliness, and also the attacks on the left-wing party of the workers. And that's not as clear cut in Chile. Milei is a different figure. He's the outsider, and he's also not Kast. His main enemy is the political caste. So this political dimension is much stronger than in Chile. His language is the language of the market, individual liberty, shock, and it's more like an anarcho-capitalism, which is also not the case in Chile. But it also includes a very strong claim to the executive, meaning that the social welfare state needs to be cut back, but the social welfare state does not disappear completely. There's a clear hand of the state in it. So Kast somehow combines both elements stemming from Bolsonaro and Milei without being identical to them. The first travel abroad by Kast, one trip abroad, took him to Argentina. And so the first head of state that he visited was Milei. Yes, as elected president. And maybe an additional question regarding the tradition and previous structures that link these personalities, Milei, Kast, Bolsonaro. It's not something that has just jumped into existence now, but actually harks back a certain time. Maybe we can actually speak to those commonalities a bit more. What I do recall is that for a very long time they have been visiting each other, and they meet each other, and have been meeting. And I think that is what highlights this transnational network. They're not identical, as I said, but they are part of this transnational extreme right-wing movement. They have the CPAC, for example, the Conservative Political Action Conference. They attended it in the United States. And then there is also a transnational network of conservative politicians and activists where they talk about the values of the family, religious freedom, and the Forum of Madrid, for example, which is linked to the right-wing party in Spain, Vox. And that is also linked to a network with Viktor Orban in Hungary. If I'm correct, they're all part of this constellation. They are part and parcel of it. They meet within that network, and Kast is clearly within that field, but not as a carbon copy. He takes on certain aspects regarding immigration, security, sovereignty. Anti-communism is a salient point, clearly, investments, but he translates that into the Chilean context. In Chile, it's still different. Yes. Maybe another aspect that we can include before looking at Milei more in detail, and I'd like to put that to Clayton. Something that I see as a commonality or a similar trait in these constellations is anti-feminism, anti-trans tendencies, and we just heard, with the example of Chile, the question regarding abortion rights. Maybe we can shed some light on how that was a salient topic under Bolsonaro, anti-feminism and the violence. You have to clearly say that against queer people, trans people, and the question of abortion. And then I'd like to move on to Milei. Perhaps Clayton, please.
Yes, Bolsonaro, he didn't like women, and he always said that. He said that when he has 3 men and 1 girl, and then in an interview he said, well, I have 3 wonderful men, and when I got a little bit weak, I had a girl. And
as children, also als Kinder.
What?
As children.
As children?
Yes, like the children. But there is something that I would like to talk about just a little bit before about what we have been talking before about corruption and a new group of power, a new illegal group of power in Brazil is being very strong. That is named milícias. Milícias in Brazil are a new group like cops that or they have left the company or they are still in the company, and they arrived to a community, to a favela, and then they say, okay, now we are the owners of this place, and you who lives here must pay us because we are your owner of the place. If you want to hire some internet, you have to buy our internet. If you want to have, if you want to use water, you need to pay ourselves for your water. So, and this group is being very strong, and they move a lot of money. So, in the future, I believe we're going to have a lot of problems with milícias because they are getting very strong and achieving some power. I would like to say this also. And corruption in Brazil, my friend Claudia is right. Unfortunately, we cannot think about Brazilian politics without thinking in corruption. But it arrived in Brazil when we were colonized in the 16th century. And one of the first cases of corruption was when people from Portugal got in the power in Brazil, and they started stealing our gold and all of this that colonization does. And this person was like expulsed of Brazil. And this is the very first case of corruption brought by a Portuguese one in our country. And so, in the beginning of the country, when they say that country started, they just brought corruption with us. So when Brazil started building itself, they had corruption since the very beginning, and it's very hard to finish corruption, the politics corruption in Brazil. Now, replying you, that's true. Bolsonaro was with a journalist. He was always screaming with the girls, saying, no, you're not intelligent. And once he was with a woman from politics, and then he said to her, you are so ugly that I couldn't even rape you.
Oh, God.
And it sounded terrifically sure. And nowadays, the numbers of the feminicide in Brazil is on the highest level. In each 6 minutes, a woman is going to be murdered in Brazil. In each 23 minutes, a black person is going to be murdered in Brazil. Brazil is the country who most kills the LGBT community. You say this, LGBT community?
Yeah.
Is the country who most kills in all the world. All around the world. Of course, it has raised because we have had a president in 4 years saying women must be raped. That if you were a trans person, you were. Bolsonaro had a sentence of his government that it was God, fatherland, and family. If you mix these three kind of things, you will prepare a cake of big nationalism. And that's what he did. So, God, so if you are not from his religious, you are not from God. And Brazil, the most people, we are black, the most people in Brazil. And we have the black religious. Of course, Bolsonaro is not from these religious. So in his powers, in his moments of power, a lot of places that was not from his religious, people, society, put fire on that places because he said God. Then he said fatherland. So if you are not fighting for Brazil, you are not from this country and you must be out of here. So in his power, in his time of power, he was always saying, oh, if you don't like Brazil, go to Cuba. If you don't like Brazil, go to... and then he started saying any country. So this is fatherland. And then family. And then he said, if you are a gay person, you are not able to do a family. You are not from God, and you are not from our fatherland. So gay people, trans people, women that would like to do abortion is forbidden in Brazil. He was saying that it was not from the family concept. So people start killing these kinds of people, women that does abortion, gay people, trans people, and people who criticize Brazil in his times of his period of power because you were not respecting our nationalism. So thank God Bolsonaro left the power, and thank God Bolsonaro is now in jail. But nowadays I have to be scared with his 3 children and their children, and they are coming. So next year I talk to you.
Thank you, Clayton. Claudia Zilla, jetzt ist das vielleicht sogar gar nicht so schlecht als thematischer Übergang zu...
Well, this is maybe a good way to get us to Milei. Milei, I mean, we might want to look at him as a solitary example, although there are lots of hybrid forms and overlapping forms. But what has been mentioned last is something we hear from Milei also all the time, a very raw, brutal, violent language is what he speaks. He's anti-feminist, anti-queer, anti-trans. So maybe we should start and talk about Milei's language. Can you describe it a bit for us, please? Yeah. The language in Argentina is getting more and more violent, more brutal than you would have ever imagined. I mean, he's tweeting all the time. He's extremely aggressive. He always moves directly on the personal level when communicating with others. So he has those authoritarian feelings, and he does not want to admit any different sort. I mean, he's single, he has no children, he has dogs, though, 4 cloned dogs, who are all named after neoliberal scientists representing the Austrian school. And they're also very violent, so they can never be together. So they are in the residence, but they are never together. They are always kept apart, because otherwise these dogs would attack each other all the time. These are violent dogs. Right. That's probably not the topic we will talk about today, the dogs, but his younger sister is his right hand, and she doesn't have a family either, so she's not married either, she doesn't have children either. And I mean, what you've just said is true. Right now, Milei has a very conservative discourse as far as the values are concerned. However, his own life is not really a conservative one. He is not really religious. He is Catholic, Roman Catholic, but he says he could imagine to become Jewish because he believes in the superiority of the West. This is, of course, a construct. It doesn't exist in this form, but he speaks of Western values and the Western culture, which means the post-colonial doesn't have any room there. The indigenous doesn't have any room there. A heterogeneity is nothing which would find a place in this culture of dominance he identifies with. So he feels close to Israel for that very reason, he says. But he's an outsider, so he's different from Bolsonaro or Kast or others. He is an outsider. He's not a politician. He's never been a politician. He was a scientist. And under Macri's conservative government, he began to criticize the economy and the economic policy of the government. And he said he was more conservative and he knew why this policy failed, so he suggested shock therapies and other tools. He was always very evident and visible in his whole appearance. And of course, this is a capital which the media loved to exploit. He was invited more and more often. He was on TV more and more often, and then eventually a new government was elected. And he always said he was different. So he was not representing neither the right nor the left wing. It's an ultra libertarian policy. He pursues a powerful state which takes care of everything in order to also make sure that you don't have any monopoly, any oligopoly in the country. So he is a libertarian, which is why he is also criticizing the Chicago school, for example. He doesn't want any regulation of the market ever. I mean, of course, you need a central bank, and he keeps it. I mean, actually, in the beginning, he said he wanted to do away with the central bank also, but he hasn't abandoned it so far. He hasn't abolished it so far. But he is kind of unique. He also says that everybody should be entitled to sell their organs. So he says, you can determine what happens to your body. On the other hand, he doesn't want women to decide whether they want to have an abortion or not, because abortion is murder. He says it's especially a murder because you commit this assassination of someone who is related to you, who's a relative. So a lot of what he does is really against human beings. At the same time, it's ambivalent. He gets the support from conservative groups who actually want to see traditional family policy and who want to see traditional values preserved. But he has this extreme libertarian, anarchic, capitalist ideology, which he adds up with elements or fragments he takes from conservative groups. So, as I said, he's Catholic, but he says he wants to be Jewish. Bolsonaro was an evangelical evangelical. Others are also representing the, Kast, as we heard, is representing the Wissenschaft group ideology. One more question concerning Milei, and please put me right if I'm wrong. When people write about Milei in Germany, they go and describe, right, it's radical, it's libertarian, they also call it anarchic capitalist, they also describe the measures he takes, deregulation, sacking state employees, taking back social programs and so on. But this particular element, the violence of his language and his radical hate against human beings is not being covered. The media don't talk about it. I don't know whether you have realized he was in Davos at the World Economic Forum. There he gave a speech. And some people said, well, this was embarrassing. It was kind of embarrassing. But what he said and the way he appeared there was kind of smooth. That's what I think. Am I right? I wonder. I mean, am I right to say that this aspect is being overlooked here? Indeed. Indeed, the media tend to focus very much on his economic policy.
Oder eine Reform des Staates, die meines Erachtens in Argentinien unbedingt notwendig ist. Nur ich würde sagen,
they
nicht
talk
so.
About what is being needed in Argentina.
Und nicht die ganze Dimension von,
and they tend to
was für eine Sprache, was
overlook the whole
für ein
dimension,
Verständnis,
so
was
they
für ein
don't talk about
Menschenbild,
the
was für
language,
ein
not about
Verständnis von
the
Gesellschaft,
idea
was für ein
of a human
Verständnis von
being he
Demokratie.
has,
Man
the
hat's nie
human
geschafft,
image, his idea of democracy. All
aus
this
dem Munde
is
von
being
Milei,
ignored.
Sagen zu lassen, sozusagen,
They
dass
never have
Demokratie von allen
him
möglichen Regimen
quoted.
bei allen Defiziten und Defekten und
I
was
mean,
weiß
he,
ich und Zulänglichkeiten
he spoke
doch
about democracy
das
and
wie
the
her
need
beste
for
Regime ist.
going beyond.
Gefragt,
I mean, people tend to ask him, isn't democracy the best system? And he answers, well, freedom we need and property. But he never goes and says, democracy is the best system we have, or my democracy looks this or that way. So democracy is not a word he uses at all. On the other hand, he doesn't go as far as Bolsonaro did.
Also arbeitet, muss schon und macht das, arbeitet mit dem Parlament.
He cooperates with the parliament, for example. Let me give you an example. We have three powers in our state, and the parliament is very important, and the parliament can also undertake certain initiatives. However, the government is more important than the parliament, but of course you need parliament in order to have a democratic rule. So I'd say that Milei is still within the framework of what you would call democracy. I mean, he has issued lots of decrees already. These are regulations imposed by the government, and they are valid as long as the two chambers of parliament agree to them. So far, none of the chambers has withdrawn or taken back decrees by Milei or previous presidents. But there is particular understanding of what is public and what is coexistence. And here, Milei is very individualistic. It's even social Darwinism he kind of represents. He says everybody is equal before the law. Thus, I'm not a racist. But he doesn't recognize that there is structural injustice or structural inequality, and that we are not born the same in terms of our health. And we do not pick our families, and we don't pick the neighborhood where we live, and we don't pick the state where we live. So the ideology of Milei is there is a double lottery. So pretend that everybody is equal. However, I cannot pick the milieu into which I am being born. That's a fact, that's a given. And then you have particular social and societal structures, and you also have structures of the state which imply certain inequalities. So not everything is inborn, so to speak. The state creates inequality and injustice, but the state is also the institution to equalize in order to find a way to have people be more equal. So we are not all lucky the same way, but we can better coexist if there is an institution, i.e. the state, which helps mitigate and which helps equalize. So there are differences, but you need an intervention in order to help people who are in the worst position. But he goes and says, let's do away with the state. We don't need the state. Paying taxes means you rob people, you just take their money, that's not good. And there is no support for the weaker or for vulnerable groups in his policy. Milei carries out a policy of privileges and special privileges. So he does this, and yet he goes and says everybody is equal before the law. He simply ignores, consciously ignores the inequality. Well, in our last round here on the podium, I would like to talk about counter-movements, looking once again at Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. What is there in order to do something about these authoritarian impact or interventions? Because I think there are major differences between the countries in terms of the social movements you see. But before we do this, I would like to briefly talk about the influence of Donald Trump and his imperialistic foreign policy. I went to Chile, I met Mauro, and we were in Valparaiso and then in Santiago de Chile when the U.S. aircraft carrier approached Venezuela and was getting closer and closer. Only when I was there in Chile, i.e. not far away in Berlin anymore, I realized what this meant in terms of a threat. It was threatening. I mean, this was just before the kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela by the Trump administration. So my question to Mauro is, what impact does this have for the groups, for the movements in Chile, or in the group? So the kidnapping in Venezuela, what consequences did this have? But also the permanent threat, the intimidation you have all the time. I mean, you see it on the whole continent. It's maybe different in different countries. It's Mexico, it's Cuba. I mean, I would like to hear from Santiago, or from the Santiago perspective. What impression does Trump leave with his interventions and his threats?
Nur eine ganz kurze Themen zu was Claudia gesagt hat.
I would like to briefly comment on what Claudia said, because it's important what she said. Kast is not really eccentric, right?
Macht nicht den permanente verbale Bruch.
He does not be a person to execute any real rupture. So he seems to be softer, and thus he can be more efficient in certain contexts. Like what he's doing right now, he seems to be moderate. And he tries to implement a more moderate policy in Chile. That's what he pretends. Now, Trump.
Ich glaube, das ist sehr verbunden. Man kann das nicht trennen,
I think you cannot really draw a line between what you see from the Chilean perspective and from other places. So what Trump did in Venezuela is closely connected to the idea that crime and Venezuela are connected in the perspective in Chile. Maybe we have to explain this. Why is Venezuela and crime so closely associated in Chile or in people's mind? Well, there is a major migration wave from Venezuela. It has been the case for a number of years, i.e. since the beginning of the crisis in Venezuela. So you have lots of Venezuelan migrants, and many of them went to Chile. And a new form of crime has come up, something new, something we hadn't known until then. So we really have to differentiate and see the difference between what is ideology and what is truth. So there was a new form of crime which we hadn't known until then, and where people's lives don't matter anymore. In former times, crime was different. This was about property, right? This was about private property, my house, my home, whatever I own. But this crime was about people's lives, and that was new. So this connects Venezuela also with Colombia and the migration from Colombia.
So in terms of Trump, when he started this attack on Venezuela, people actually were more celebratory than actually critical of it. They saw this as a necessary measure, and also in order to solve the Chilean problem. And Kast actually made this very plain. But I mean, nothing much was solved, really. Maduro was kidnapped, but neither was the democratic opposition enabled, nor was there any attempt. I mean, there were some political prisoners that were liberated, apparently, but not much has really changed on the ground since. I would say in the last week alone, the talks were started in order to make sure that those who had actually been processed under the law and had been condemned to be returned to Venezuela. And that wasn't possible previously. So right now they're exploring this possibility that Chilean aircraft with Venezuelan prisoners or convicts could then land in Venezuela. So currently we're still in the phase of talks. With this different perception, i.e. celebration of the intervention in Venezuela, does that lead to a situation where the imperial foreign policy or imperialistic foreign policy of Trump is being seen in a more positive light than I personally assumed? Or is it also seen as a kind of neo-imperialistic intervention? I think people do differentiate that very clearly. This is a special case of Venezuela and has to be seen apart from neo-imperialistic ambitions or approaches by Trump, and that is certainly also criticized by people in the political system. So there's also a very public aspect about that. But when it comes to Venezuela, it's seen on a separate plane. Well, maybe looking at Venezuela, looking at the historic development, what is actually happening then? I would call it a neo-imperial foreign policy, but maybe you would see it differently. No, I think I do agree. I mean, looking at the epithet neo, what is really new, what is really imperial in the way a country arrogates upon itself for the right to exert power beyond its boundaries. Something that is perhaps different to the past is that in the past soft power was a factor, and there was also discourse about promoting democracy and of combating poverty through investments, and that the American way of life was being promoted. So there was an attempt to make the United States attractive. And all of these, this entire toolbox of soft power has been reduced greatly, and we see that this was also within the development of the United States. Development cooperation, development aid, all of that has been scaled back. That was a way of making the United States attractive in the past. And now it's been much more obviously linked to power politics. And both in the United States, when it comes to the security strategies, as well as in the defense manual this year, it is clear that the Monroe Doctrine has been reactivated, and that has two dimensions. A, the United States claims to be the dominant power in the region and in the Western Hemisphere. That would not only include Latin America, starting with Mexico and all the way down to the tip of Latin America, but also Greenland. And it would also mean that regionally foreign powers are excluded. And then that means that it becomes difficult for countries who have governments who consider themselves loyal to Trump and his politics, but also have a very strong trade policy. So Chile is a leader in terms of market-oriented policies, a smaller state with a smaller footprint, and a very open market economy, and there's not that much to be regulated or to be changed like in Argentina and other countries. So for Chile, it's very, very important as a trading partner, and Chile also has an orientation towards the Pacific sphere, also in terms of foreign policy. And the United States is not necessarily seen in the most positive light by those countries, and there's the first elements of conflict that arise, and Trump has with actually cancelled visas for the foreign government, or the previous government in Chile, because they had a project with Chile. And but then Chileans do say, well, this model also helped reduce poverty, but we don't want to go away completely from an open economy and from trading with partners that are actually beneficial to us. So that's where friction could arise. Apart from that, all of them, Bolsonaro, Milei, and Kast, are all in favor of the United States intervening in Venezuela. They were positive with the results, and they also belong to the Shield of America, the new initiative. And my concern is that this will lead to militarization of the fight against drugs, which is not helpful, and it will also lead to a very inhumane migration policy. And that leads to pressure and repercussions if you don't join in. And then I also believe that the populations themselves should decide about the policies of their governments and not Washington. So we could actually set up a separate event here on how Trump supported Bolsonaro, or how Trump also supported Milei with various means and measures. Always in the run-up to elections in Brazil, there was also a massive intervention when it came to the legal proceedings. We could set up an entire separate event on that topic, but what I'm interested in order to hark back to that question, what instruments, what tools, democratic institutions, but also perhaps what kind of social movements existed or could possibly exist that could give us some ray of hope? What elements of opposition dissidency or counter-movements are conceivable. And I'd like to look at the different countries, but I mean, in Brazil, it was already possible once before. So I'd like to know, what were the institutions that retained stability, that were incorruptible in a way, and what kind of social, cultural movement made this resistance possible?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, because I have been talking about things that sometimes does not work very well in Brazil, but we have to say that we have great social movements for fight against these kinds of politicians. So, for example, the last election, we really thought Bolsonaro would have the second the presidential
Success?
Government. And artists, professors, students, gays, trans people, new kinds of families. People went to street to make number, to show in number that we were a lot of people against these kinds of politics. And Bolsonaro lost. So what we realized, that the most people in Brazil does not agree with these kinds of things, with these kinds of government. And we are alive, we are paying attention to what's going on, and we are together as people. Brazilian people is such an amazing people, and we are together against these kinds of governments. So I believe this year we are going to do again. There is an avenue in Brazil named Avenida Paulista and Avenida Copacabana that all the country goes when they want to show that people are together. So in Avenida Paulista, like 1 million people screaming out against Bolsonaro and against his kinds of politics. So that lots of newspaper, for example, together with people saying that things that he said or he says or he did is not right. One of his child, I think it's Eduardo, yeah, he ran away from Brazil when Lula got the power. And when his father was in jail, he ran away, and sure, he went to United States. And Trump, that it was someone that Bolsonaro was always speaking, no, I have the help of Trump, Trump helps me, so we are strong. And when he was in jail, Trump said, oh, Bolsonaro, goodbye, now I like Lula. And he got lost. So nowadays, what we have people together, professors, students, journalists, lawyers, ministers, judges, on the street defending democracy. This is a very, very delicate year in our country.
Kann ich fragen, welche Rolle Kunst?
What is the role of art and culture? You yourself are a performer, you're a director, an actor. So what is the role of artists and cultural institutions in all of this, what you just described?
Yes, in the very beginning, artists got a little bit frightened to make position, to say who they were and what they were thinking about. But things started getting so crazy that artists needed to go and to say what they are thinking and that they were against these kinds of politics. And what's happening really nowadays is that we have a lot of plays and a lot of movies. Brazil got our first Oscar last year with the movie I'm Still Here. That this movie talks about the dictatorship in Brazil, that it was very, 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 very bloody. And after this, now we have the secret agent that talks about the same thing, dictatorship. And nowadays, many plays, for example, my play, I'm here doing this play, Apes, I am talking about a system that kills black people constantly. In every 3 minutes, black people are being killed in Brazil. So nowadays, it's very common. 10 years ago, when I started doing this play, People used to tell me, you are crazy. You're crazy to talk about this. You, a young artist, speaking like this, what society will think about you? Well, 10 years later, now I see a lot of monologues, a lot of black women doing their monologues, a lot of black poor people from favelas doing their plays, a lot of plays acted only by trans people. And for example, there was, I believe that it was a Hamlet, acted only by trans people. And it was a huge success in my country. What happened in the art movement, art culture? Every time they try to make us not to speak, the situation happens the opposite. People want to go out of home and want to do these kinds of plays, these kinds of movies, these kinds of performances, saying that we are not, they are not gonna jail us. We are going to be on the street doing our jobs, doing our plays, doing our movies. And he got absolutely frightened because when I'm Still Here was nominated for Oscar, he said, oh, because people from left culture, from left politics in Brazil they are friends of people from Oscar. It has nothing to do with anything. So what are we seeing nowadays? Art people and professors and the ministers, we are together to speak truth about our history. There is an idea that we cannot talk about our history because that's true. There are lots of chapters in Brazilian history that they are very bloody, but we have to talk not to happen again. And that's what's going on absolutely right now. Every theater you go, there is a black person doing this play. There is trans people doing this play. There are people from favela dancing their dances, their funky, their samba, because this is from people culture. Now in Brazil, it is very strong, and I do believe that is an answer for Bolsonaro's times.
Vielen, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Mauro, vielleicht ist das in
Mauro.
Chile natürlich jetzt gerade
Maybe
noch relativ frisch.
events are still too recent in Chile. Just recently, a right-wing government was voted into office. But maybe you can already identify the main actors or players, be it from the representative political system or from the social cultural sphere. What kind of social movements exist, or where are the oppositional trends, or who are those quarters? Where are those quarters that express perhaps an opposition? I think there's a very important dimension that I'd like to start with, and that is that culture actually, culture is a central battlefield for the right-wing movement. And it is about the battle for the common sense. And in this context, I believe that democratic culture, public criticism, and the demand to bring humanity back, and to get back to your question, I think they have a role to play there. Yes, in the context of a culture war, in this modern sense, also in the sense of German history, this is something that is very, very important, this battle for common sense. I think, and I come back to this word that I used at the very beginning in Chile, the situation was defined as a state of emergency in a way. And that state of emergency has a very important political function. It is not just that the fact that there are serious problems that are undeniably so, but that the emergency or state of emergency becomes and transforms itself into a way of government. What are the most important problems? Which are the problems that can be set back? What kind of authority does the state exert? I believe that policies based on the state of emergency lead to a form of government. And in this context, criticism is very, very difficult because it's a definition of reality, definition of problems, definition of solutions that is at stake. And I think right now in the context of Chile, I do see great difficulties to actually posit a different understanding of reality and promote that.
Das, glaube ich, ist, was ich heute sehe.
What I do see nowadays, and I'd like to intervene, says Carolin, this pessimism is also linked, and that was my impression, to what we consider the public sphere. Well, in Germany, we would say that it's theater, debates as the one that we're having here. In Chile and Argentina, that area is also very developed. We have a strong public sphere, institutions that offer space for discourse. Obviously, we have the media in its various guises, classic media and new media. Is it true that it is being, or that it is weaker in Chile, or that there are fewer such spaces where a political, democratic, yes, politicization or even development of a political opinion can happen? I think that that is a correct view. I think in comparison it is a very reduced public sphere.
It's certainly also important to not focus on the person, Bolsonaro, Milei, Miloni. I mean, they are not the cause, actually. They are not the ones who trigger the move towards the right. We do have these changes in the common sense. I mean, it would be a mistake to think so. We do have to recognize the pattern. We do have to recognize what is actually happening. Insecurity, fear, a cry for order. I mean, all this becomes part of a political language which pretends to find solutions. And we do see a certain radicalization. We see a certain radicalization which makes sense in the eyes of the people, which is why they vote for these people. And that's, I guess, what we see in Chile today. And this is what we have to bear in mind when talking about democracy.
Heute glaube ich, das Problem von der alternative Perspektive ist, dass, okay, wir können die nächste Wahlen wieder gewinnen,
I mean, you
aber wozu?
can go and say we will win the next elections, though there are lots who say, okay, what do we do? That's what the perspective on the other side, on the alternative side, is for many, because there are changes in the common sense, and these changes won't disappear. Well, I want to end on a positive note. Definitely, I need to. So, Claudia, please, it's your task now to get me to this positive note. What are the players? Who are the players? Who are the institutions? What are the institutions that might help us articulate another discourse?
Argentinien hat ja eine Tradition.
I mean, I'm asking you because of the particular situation of Argentina, right? I would like to rather spread hope in terms of players. I do see different players. I don't see the one player, the one institutions we need to we need to protect democratic structures in order to get rid of Bolsonaro. That's the first important thing, right? So we have to see the priority in the civil society, which is also important in terms of resistance, in terms of opposition. We need the votes. We need the voices and the votes of all these people. And we have to also ask, why did they vote the way they voted? I mean, there are those who would go and say, I didn't know, or I didn't believe. And then there are those who would probably say it's not going to be as bad as people say. But then there was the threat of a military coup in Brazil. But I mean, hope. There is hope also with respect to the outside. I'm not only looking at domestic policy, because there is evidence that the military forces in the US under Biden made it clear to the military forces in Brazil that they wouldn't support a coup, which is why the coup planned by Bolsonaro against Lula failed. So there were voices from the Pentagon, and there were lots of dialogues and lots of effort, which made clear that they would respect the result of the election, and they wouldn't intervene. And there would not be any support for the military in the country in the aftermath of the elections. So the willingness to get to intervene of the US is also an important aspect to be seen. Although we need to clearly see that Trump is Biden. But this is certainly also an important aspect to help us protect the democracy. And then, of course, we have to look at the internal situation. And as long as we do have these democratic shifts, we need to focus on the Congress and the Parliament. And Congress and the Parliament should play an independent role. They are independent institutions. They cannot just follow the government. Now, the elites, because we talk about institutions, elites, this might be the civil center of society or others, need to adopt the project. I mean, in the polls, Lula and Bolsonaro son are the same. In this polls, Lula is going to be 81 years old when the next elections come. So what's going to happen? I mean, Flavio Bolsonaro was born in 1981. Lula is 81, so... Right-wing radicals always win with the support of conservative forces. Otherwise, they can't gain majorities. So the traditional right wing, the conservatives also have to ponder the idea of what to do. Are they interested in a further radicalization? If not, they must not collaborate with the right wing. Now, what about the civil society? Now, this is also about funding. We do have a cultural sector, maybe not in Chile, but in Brazil and in Argentina, the cultural sector was also sponsored by the government. Now, it's important that the cultural scene does not be intimidated. I mean, of course, if your life is at risk, you are in a legitimate position to protect yourself. So I don't want to ask you to be a hero, right? But you should not be intimidated either. is what I'm saying. Like, for example, on March 8th, when the International Women's Day was celebrated, we saw lots of people in Argentina in the streets, not only women, not only the left wing, but also the civil center, or when the anniversary was celebrated 50 years after the military coup in Argentina, which was 50 years ago. There was also a major mobilization. However, this mobilization doesn't help us if these people are being elected again and again and again. It doesn't help you to get many people in the streets if then they go and nevertheless vote for those right-wing radicals. So we do have to see the field of tension between what is and democracy. I think it's a mission we need to accept, and improving the situation is certainly a task to be taken up by everybody. Now, I'm trying to find something positive. Well, vote for the right people is what I'm saying.
Ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you
Vielleicht
very much.
eine Anmerkung von mir
Maybe
noch zum Schluss,
one
bevor wir dann gerne das
final
Forum
remark
öffnen, und
from
jetzt
my
die
side
Fragen
before
stellen
the
können.
audience gets a chance to ask questions or take the floor.
Ich wollte gerne diese Diskussion nicht nur
I did not only want to talk about these topics because the countries we talk about are countries I'm interested in, but because we are dealing with the same questions here. I mean, what are we experiencing here? What similarities do we see in the programs, in the world visions, in the ideologies, and also in terms of the rule of law, which we need to protect, and also in terms of the revisionism and the nostalgia. We see people tend to look back at the past with nostalgia more and more here too. So we do see the differences between the countries, but there are also elements which help us understand what's going on here so that we don't go the whole way here, not the whole way of what we saw in your countries. Well, I would like to invite the audience now to take the floor and ask questions, and you will find mics. We have roving mics, and please raise your hands, and please wait for